Hello and welcome to this, the fourth of 5 video lectures about the human value of tolerance. It is called Inequality and explores the question, what is society finding harder and harder to tolerate today? There's a lot of talk about inequality. What do we mean by that word? Inequality is about the size of the individual slices of society's pie. Different knowledge, wealth, health, outcomes. In the 4 video lectures on the human value of progress, we were focused on how societies increase the overall or aggregate capacity to act of the people in that society. The more progress or social development, the more knowledge, wealth and health in that society. But of course, even in an advanced industrial society, the overall level of social development is important to me, but so is my share relative to other members of my society. A good question then is, what are the drivers of inequality, of unequal shares of social development, of different size of the slices of society's pie? Surely the biggest driver of all is that we have respect for a status hierarchy in our collective subconscious. According to Jordan Peterson, we share half our DNA with lobsters and an even closer relative, chimps, are social animals like us with dominance hierarchies. So status hierarchies built on dominance or power are not something new. They are not something unnatural. They have nothing to do with the spread of capitalism. They are certainly not only a Western thing. Respect for hierarchies is in our collective subconscious. By the way, chimps achieve dominance principally through physical strength, but the ability to form a gang helps. Humans added weapons, tactics, and ruthlessness when competing for dominance and power. Peterson goes further. Any group of people doing something is subject to Price's law. Price's law. Half the work is done by the square root of the population. That means if 10 people are working, 3 are doing half the work. 10,000 people are working, 100 are doing half the work. Status also can come in human societies from competence. So any group of people involved in a joint enterprise is likely to confer status on those doing it well, those who are competent, those who have merit. You can see where the word meritocracy comes from. For humans, status and position in the hierarchy can come from either power or competence. We'll be looking at power in the next video lecture called Politics, but for now, let's just understand that we humans are used to and find value in hierarchies. That must be the case. If we didn't value hierarchies, we would have dropped them at some point in our conscious development. But we didn't. So we respect hierarchies, even though that respect means different knowledge, wealth, health, outcomes for different individuals. Another thought from Jordan Peterson. Even functional hierarchies predicated on competence have elements of brutality. In another video called White Privilege, he talks about Harvey Weinstein, who rose up the ranks of the film producing hierarchy through competence. He was a very capable producer. Then he became a tyrant, abusing his position of power and status. It's an extreme example of why meritocracy is not perfect and why we need things like the Me Too movement. Hierarchies, whether predicated on power or competence, are a driver of inequality. What else drives inequality apart from our tolerance of hierarchies? Well, when society enforces social segregation, society creates disadvantage for the population segregated out, which drives unequal outcomes for the disadvantaged. But in the West, we spent the second half of the 20th century getting enforced social segregation out of our societies until we had equality before the law for everyone. So now, in the absence of society-enforced social segregation, unequal circumstances lead to unequal outcomes. There's the circumstances of the individual, their aptitude, their willingness to learn, whether they've got an inner drive and the self-discipline needed to get on, relational skills, personal responsibility. Many, including Jordan Peterson, stress that last point, and most of us accept the importance of personal responsibility and wish everyone else did. Then there's the circumstances of the individual's family, which has a big impact. What do you find in their homes? Books or drugs? Were they born with a silver spoon in their mouth, or is their family struggling? What happens in their home? Do they get loving support or abuse, indifference, despair? And the circumstances and the community that the family lives in matter. Are there role models and mentors? What facilities are there in the community? What infrastructure is there? What is the reputation of the neighborhood? For immigrants, what is the degree of assimilation? The reputation of your neighborhood declared on your job application in the address box might contribute to you not getting an interview. If you are raised in an unassimilated community, you might not pick up those ever so slight social airs and graces of the indigenous people around you, so you can come across as someone foreign. And of course, for any individual, chance plays a big role. Could be you meet misfortune and tragedy, or, more hopefully, opportunity for which you're prepared, and luck, remembering, as someone said, that the more you practice, the luckier you get. The different circumstances we find ourselves in are major drivers towards the different outcomes that we experience. But, given our tolerance of hierarchy, and our individual family, our family, our community circumstances, and chance, then there's a wholly different set of drivers of inequality. In advanced industrial societies, there are also society-level drivers of inequality, indifferent to gender, ethnicity, or race, or sexuality, affecting individuals, families, and communities. These are society-level drivers of inequality. Matthew Stewart studies wealth inequality in the US. He wrote an influential article for the Atlantic magazine, cited bottom left, in which he describes how wealth inequality fell for a sustained period in the 20th century and then started rising again. For his studies, Stewart divides US society into three classes. There's the top 0.1%, not 1%, but 0.1%, the next 9.9%, and the bottom 90%. From the 1930s, that's after the Depression, until the mid-80s, inequality fell. The 90% gained from the 0.1% first, then the 9.9%. The bottom 90% doing well at the expense of the top 10%. First the top 0.1%, then the 9.9%. Then, from the mid-1980s to 2012, in just over one generation, this happened to wealth distribution in the US. For the 0.1%, their share of the wealth pie in the US went from 10% to 22%. Who are those? Those are the billionaires, the multimillionaires, the plutocrats, the fat cats, the hedges, the tech bros, and the rest. It's 0.1% means the top 160,000 US household. Their wealth, their share of the wealth pie went up from 10 to 22%, more than doubling in just over one generation. For the 9.9%, that's the upper middle class, those who believe their own meritocratic propaganda but pass on privilege to their children, their share of the wealth pie stayed the same. For the bottom 90%, all that increase in share of wealth, the 0.1%, came from them. Their share of the wealth pie of the US, according to Stewart, dropped from 35% to 23%. Who are the bottom 90%? Well, there's some college-educated people there holding on. The very poor are usually state-supported, so the rest are struggling. And social mobility, according to Stewart, is falling. So in one generation, 12% of the US wealth pie moved from the bottom 90% up to the top 0.1%. That's a big change. What were the drivers of that change from gently decreasing inequality, which we had from the Depression in the 1930s up to the mid-80s, to the rapidly rising inequality? What were the drivers, the society-level drivers of that change? Here we're going to see 6 of them. The first 2 here. The 6 are the 6 possible drivers of increasing inequality, macroeconomic drivers. And we see the single arrow because the inequality was reducing from the 1930s to mid-80s. And then we see that double arrows pointing upwards with a rapid increase in inequality from the mid-80s to 2012. 2 big changes. Globalization first. And here we've taken the average export to GDP ratios from World in Data. When inequality was falling, it was something around 10%. When it's rising rapidly, inequality is rising rapidly, it's up at 20%. It's a measure of globalization. What about immigration into the US? It was falling during that period from the 30s to the mid-80s as inequality fell. It surged in the mid-80s to 2012 as inequality surged. These 2 big changes are what President Trump has persuaded his Republican colleagues to focus on. About immigration, Edward Luce, who is a commentator for the Financial Times, so likely a classical liberal, has said, every racist is anti-immigration, but the reverse is not necessarily true. To question current levels of immigration needs only a concern for your own national culture and/or competence in arithmetic. David Leonhardt, who is not a conservative, in the New York Times article cited bottom left, worries about how surging immigration has hurt people who compete for lower paid jobs. In his article, he advocates reducing or at least holding constant the level of immigration by people who would compete for lower and middle wage jobs, while increasing immigration among people who would compete for higher wage jobs. That ought to reduce inequality. 2 more possible drivers of increasing inequality, macroeconomic drivers. Union membership in the US was rising as inequality was falling. It's now falling as inequality is rising. And the top federal tax rates in the US, well, they were for that period from the 30s to the 80s when inequality was falling, were mostly greater than 70% top tax rates. For the period when inequality has been rising, they're mostly less than 40%. These 2 big changes tend to be a focus for the Democratic Party. Two further changes. Information Communication Technology, ICT. It was a straight line increase from the 1930s to the mid-80s, gradually telephones at first, then computers and so on and so forth, increasing. From the mid-80s, it's been an exponential increasing, ICT exponential. And economic growth, when inequality was falling, economic growth was high to medium, sometimes medium. When inequality is rising, it's been medium to low. Both of those are subjective comments, but I think defendable. Now, these two drivers get bipartisan attention, but it's mainly hand-wringing about the enormous scale of ICT development since the mid-80s. The mid-80s was when the first Apple Mac computers appeared on the scene. And for economic growth, which by the standards of the decades after World War II is pretty low today, again, hand-wringing. There are economic stimulus packages every so often to assuage the bipartisan concern with lower than previously experienced economic growth, but that's about all. Of those 6 possible society-level drivers of inequality in the US listed on the previous slide, globalization is often cited as the main driver. To see why, consider the elephant graph. Its name comes for its shape, as you can see. Let me talk you through it carefully because it's not simple, but it is illuminating. This graph concerns changes in real income of the global population. On the previous slide, we were looking at wealth distribution in the US. Now we're looking at income distribution globally. For a time period between 1988 and 2008, which corresponds to the time when inequality was rising rapidly in the US, that's what this graph is about, that time period, the same time period as on the previous slide. Along the bottom are the various levels of the world's income distribution. Poorer people in third world countries are on the left. Richer people in first world countries like the US are on the right. The population of the US is rich and spreads from roughly where that reddish oval is, that's around the 75th percentile, up to the 100th percentile, which is on the right-hand side of the graph. This is the US population, which is rich in world terms. So it's up at the richer end of the scale. The vertical scale shows the real increase in incomes that the world enjoyed over this period. And you can see for the world's poorest, the bottom 5th percentile on the lower left, they didn't get any real increase in income over this period. The very poorest in the world stayed poor, even as the global economy boomed over this period. But up the income scale to the global middle class, which is where most of the Chinese population sit, and they did very well, clocking up real increases in income of around 70% over this period. But what about the West, including the US? How did they do? As stated earlier, you have to go to the right of the graph, to the trunk of the elephant. And there we can see at the top of the trunk, the world's richest did very well. And that includes the West's 0.1%. Coming further down the trunk, those in the West with college degrees mostly made some gains in income. But at the bottom of the trunk, the West's working class and some of the lower middle class saw reductions or stagnation in their real incomes. This prompted Edward Luce to call them the precariat, meaning people living precariously. This was a boom time for the global economy, but the precariat, who when compared to the rest of the world's population are already quite well off, did not share in the global income gains. The experience of globalization for them was factory closures, decaying infrastructure, fragmenting social structures, and stagnating wages. Who are they? Well, they are a big part of the West's population. Calling them the precariat is one of the kinder names used. Sometimes people are unkind, calling them names like deplorables. Whatever they're called, they have undoubtedly been the losers from globalization, as the elephant graph clearly shows. The global middle class did exceptionally well in those 30 years of globalization. Poverty reduction in China was in the hundreds of millions of people, a great capitalist achievement, a great development, a great leap in social development, great progress. The growth in living standards in China over the past few decades is unprecedented. In a few decades, with twice the population, China has done what the West took centuries to achieve. It was largely unforecasted and has taken everyone, including the Chinese Communist Party, by surprise. China found a way to do capitalist risk-taking that delivered progress without the rule of law that comes from reason is right and mutual restraint. Instead, the Chinese Communist Party retained its might is right privilege, a capitalist achievement of progress without the democracy that comes with tolerance. Globalization has meant the rise of China, which now the West is confronting, as well as the rise of inequality in the West. The West has woken up to the reality of a new and still growing economic superpower. But in the West, things changed. In the 20th century, people used to say what is good for General Motors is good for the US. In the 21st century, people obviously understand, it's clear now to us all, what is good for Apple is not necessarily good for the US. It used to be understood that if General Motors did well, to take one of the West's champions of 30 years ago, then many people in America, employees, suppliers, distributors, tax collectors would also do well. That's not the case now. Apple mostly floats above the US economy, and its wealth and income generation does not directly flow into the US today in the way GM's wealth generation did in the past. Good jobs can migrate globally. The US has a precariat, people living precariously. As Luce puts it, those who are losing out, growing impatient, reminding us of Barrington Moore's quote, "No bourgeoisie, no democracy." Bourgeoisie being a fancy word for middle class. Maybe we can update that little rhyme now and say no bourgeoisie means an opportunity for a no-hope candidate Trump to surprise everyone and make it to the White House. Many have noticed and commentated on what has happened, but for my money, Jordan Peterson has summed it up best. The Western working class paid a very large price for enriching the world. As well as those 6 macroeconomic factors, including the big one, globalization, there has also been a cultural change in our attitude to risk. We have become more risk-averse. Again, quoting from Edward Luce and his book, The Retreat of Liberalism. There's an enormous volume of government regulations. Everyone is expecting a risk-free life. We call this risk aversion. Capitalism is the word a fair-minded person would likely choose if they had just one word to describe the reason for the incredible progress, the increases in knowledge, wealth and health of the West in the last 200 years, and of China in the last 30 years or so. Capitalism's not so secret ingredient is that it rewards risk-taking with the profit motive. In essence, that is the social utility of capitalism. It encourages risk-taking, hence progress. Risk aversion is the opposite. We've moved, Luce tells us, from the self-centered NIMBY, not in my backyard, to the cave, citizens against virtually everything. What if we stopped taking risks? Then there would be no change. We'd stay as we are. Progress depends on some people being ready and able to take risks and change things. But overregulation and risk aversion are more likely today. From the rule of law to the rule of stasis, as Luce says, this is problematic because risk-taking is maybe the key driver of economic growth. Stasis, meaning to stay in one place, Luce asks whether this shift to risk aversion might be, to quote him, a result of our aging societies, since the old are less adventurous and more static. Whatever the explanation, we'd miss risk-taking. Perhaps we already are missing risk-taking. In addition, Luce explains that since the late 1970s, Western governments of right and left have been privatizing risk. Higher education, healthcare, pensions. At the same time, more jobs are piecemeal, outsourced, and temporary. So, not only are the West's bottom 90% suffering from globalization and the rest, but they're also having to take on more risk. That word that Luce coined, precariat, looks even more apt. As he says, more and more ordinary people must fend for themselves. Many commentators have recognized this cultural shift. Kim Brooks, in her book called Small Animals, Parenthood in the Age of Fear, and her article in the New York Times cited here, We Have Ruined Childhood. She says she highlights the effect on the rearing of children. Raising children to be risk averse in a culture of anxiety and fear rather than optimism and hope is how she describes it. Brooks says that the shift to risk averse parenting means childhood free time and self-directed activities have become taboo. The public places and spaces where kids used to learn to be people have been decimated or deemed too dangerous for those under 18. This is particularly true in poorer areas where parents are reluctant to let their children play in the streets or public parks because of fear of crime. For children at the other end of the inequality spectrum, fussy parents adopt helicopter parenting so their children hardly ever experience unsupervised play with other children. It's exactly the same for both ends of the inequality spectrum. Without places and time to play and learn with other children, development is impaired and risk aversion built into children from an early age. There are many books available now about how to bring unsupervised play and risk back into children's lives, so hopefully parents will take note. But the fact that we are damaging our children's development through risk aversion is indicative of the wider socio-economic problem that risk aversion is becoming entrenched in the West. Politicians have also noticed the increasing inequality. Populists on the right want to reduce external competition. That's trade, foreign trade, to reduce external competition in the goods market, in the market for goods. And they want to reduce immigration, to reduce external competition in labor markets. That's new. The right used to be for free trade. It was the left that was against it. But the right likes to blame foreigners, hence the change of tune. As for the left, and their support for open borders, they seem to have abandoned any consideration of the interests of the working class, for whom open borders are seen as unfair competition. Populists on the left want to regulate both ends of inequality, minimum wage increases and taxes on the rich. The left uses rising inequality to reinforce its long-standing advocacy of more tax and spend, more transfers. But its recent focus on increasing the minimum wage to a higher living wage is something many on the right also advocate. Meanwhile, the tech revolution promises driverless vehicles, bar staffless bars, accountant-free finance departments. As Luce puts it, we are at the start of a new, seemingly unstoppable technological wave. There are very few people who think that growing inequality is a good thing. What to do? A word of caution. In a book called The Great Leveler, Violence and the History of Inequality from the Stone Age to the 21st Century, Walter Scheidel comes to a cautionary conclusion that radical reductions in inequality means catastrophic change. The only things that have caused meaningful changes in inequality are epidemics and pandemics, state collapse, revolution, or world wars. Amongst sensible folk, that should rule out one remedy at least. A revolutionary cure would probably be worse than the inequality disease. To sum up on inequality, we respect hierarchies, particularly those where status comes from competence or merit. We accept some inequality in society, knowing that individual outcomes depend on the individual themselves, their family, their community, and pure chance. But the recent rise in inequality, with the bottom 90% of the US population doing so badly, means there is something else going on. Because no amount of individual responsibility, family support, or community care can fully compensate when a town's main employer ships good jobs abroad. Yes, some will find some kind of job locally, but probably lower paying. Some will move to find work, but if the country suffers a net loss of good jobs, that's still a driver of inequality. That only leaves chance. Lottery, anyone? As we saw earlier, we can list at least 6 possible macroeconomic drivers for increasing inequality in the US. Globalization, where good jobs emigrate. Immigration into the US has surged. Union membership has declined. Top tax rates have plummeted. The spread of information communication technology has been exponential. And slow economic growth, maybe that's become the new normal. And there are cultural changes that contribute to inequality. In particular, risk aversion, which is not just damaging our children's development, but also regulating down economic growth, bringing stasis. There are other cultural drivers we could list, like corporate consolidation, which, as companies get bigger and bigger, means many markets are dominated by 2 or 3 major players. Oligopolies, as the economists call them. Prices, profits, and salaries at the top of such companies are usually higher than with open market competition. And note that the tech companies emerge as, or soon become, fully formed monopolies due to network effects. Big is beautiful and profitable in business today. The point is Not everything can be blamed on globalization and the Chinese. Many, if not all, of the macroeconomic and cultural drivers of inequality and stasis are under our control. One thing's for sure, the status quo favors those who are already well established. When our societies and economies were dynamic and risk-rewarding, from the Depression in the 1930s to the mid-80s, inequality fell peacefully. Now, the 0.1% are free to spend their wealth as they please. Besides the conspicuous consumption of mega homes, yachts, supercars, and celebrity-laden parties, money can also buy political influence, in full view of the rest of us. The 9.9% like to show their merit by zoning the communities off, the communities they live in, zoning them off behind prominent walls, becoming gated communities. For the rest, the bottom 90%, not only is rising inequality very real, leading to the precariousness of life at the lower levels of society's hierarchy, but their social segregation is all too visible. Inequality is a highly complex problem with multiple macroeconomic and cultural causes that are intertwined and dynamic. There is no definitive proof of cause and effect in any of this, but it's a fact that since the mid-80s, inequality has risen significantly. Since there is no agreement on the exact cause and effect chain or the magnitude of each of the causes, so we are each free to pick the causes that most fit our pre-existing political views. You have the comfort that confirmation bias brings, since there is data out there that supports whatever cause your politically motivated reasoning chooses. There has always been inequality in the West, just as in the rest of the world. We are naturally respectful of hierarchy, and we understand that different competence levels mean different status levels. We know that different circumstances influence different outcomes. And no one with any sense really wants a revolution. Even if we understand all that, it's not easy to answer, but a question we must face: how much inequality can we tolerate? Thank you for watching. The next in the series, Understanding Ourselves Through Our Human Values, is the 5th of 5 lectures about the human value of tolerance. It is called Politics and explores the question, what constitutes politics in tolerant societies? It can be found at www.conservatus.com, where there's reasoning that resonates. Conservatus, keep safe, intact, save from danger our human values.